Welcome to Read Tech's Blanket No Change Certification webinar, focusing on the 5 steps to creating a successful submission. Before the presentation gets underway, here are just a few logistical items. First, this presentation is being recorded, so all participants have been muted. If you do have any questions, please submit them using the chat box, and we will address many of them at the end of the presentation as time allows for. If we do not get to your question, we will be sure to follow up with you this week with an answer. And finally, if you do run into any technical difficulties, you can message the organizer and I will help you try to troubleshoot that. We will be sending you all a copy of the presentation via email within the next few days. Now for today's presenters, we have 2 of our own experts from Read Tech, Senior Manager of Information Solutions, Gary Sainer, and Senior Account Executive, Dave Wilson. Gary and David will be discussing the FDA Blanket No Change Certification regulations, 5 steps to creating a successful Blanket No Change certification, the support Read Tech offers for the Blanket No Change certification, and finally, Gary and David will answer your questions that you submitted via the chat box. With that, I will hand the presentation over to Gary Sainer.
Well, thank you, Erin, and welcome everyone to this webinar. We have a timely topic and a lot of material to go through, so we'll get started first of all, laying some groundwork. Some of the basic foundation that comes about this time of the year during the annual registration period, but we'll visit some of those and let's dive into what some of the FDA regulations are. This might be a recap for you if you had been working with drug listings in the past. If this is your first time, there's a lot of good material here, so just bear with me if you already know a good portion of this. Hopefully it'll be a good reminder. So first of all, what is a drug listing certification? So every year, the FDA does require that all active drug listings on file either be updated during the course of the year, or a certification is sent in to say that this particular drug listing is current and that it is accurate. So that is a particular statement coming from the registrant to the FDA saying that all is good, everything that you have on file is up to date. On the other hand, if there are changes to be made, then you need to make an update during the course of the year, and we'll talk into the time frame about when that should be done. This particular certification is done by way of an electronic SPL file, a structured product labeling file, and that is able to be submitted to the FDA through electronic submission gateway. We'll talk about some methods later on. And you are able to bundle many of these NDC product codes together in a single file. So it's not that you're certifying each one individually. You are able to put it together, such to name the Blanket No Change certificate. Who must register? Who must certify? So the responsibility for this particular task goes back to the establishment registrant, and that can take many different forms. Typically it's a manufacturer, but it could be those repackers, relabelers, salvagers, and there always is a little bit of a mix going on here with contract manufacturer organizations. They would be responsible, but sometimes you get the private label distributors in the mix. And David, I'd like you to jump in real quickly here. In the past, have you seen this handled pretty well? There has to be some coordination, obviously, to make sure that a particular drug product is, in fact, either listed for that year and both sides know about it, or they hand off and say, you do the certification, that sort of thing. How do you think that's going in the last few years?
Yeah, good question, Gary. It's improved over time since FDA implemented this, just because industry is getting a little bit more accustomed with it. But this is a critical piece, ensuring that whether it be the contract manufacturer or the distributor or private label distributor, be actually certifying it and certifying it once. So we'll detail a little bit more as this presentation goes along how to access that data, but then where it might be tricky to access that data and confirm it. So it's definitely something that when an organization is working with a contract manufacturer as the distributor, you should make sure it's explicitly clear as to who's going to be submitting this data.
Okay, very good. Well, good to hear that it's getting a little bit better than when originally rolled out. There are other individuals and agents. So if there is an authorized agent, such as a U.S. agent acting on behalf of the registrant, importers, consultants, and some others, they are able to legally submit this drug certification on behalf of the registrant. Another question, and we're just kind of laying some groundwork here, what drug listings must be certified? So pretty broad statement here from the FDA, every active drug listing on file. So you see many different variations there. We won't go into all those details, but it's pretty much all the drug listings that are on file at the FDA would need to be either updated in the course of the year or included in this blanket no change certification. A quick note at the bottom, if there is a veterinary drug product, they do not follow the same procedures as CDER and CBER. There's a link there for you to contact them and find out the particulars on certifying a veterinary drug product. So what is the criteria for a drug listing to be included in this blanket no change? So first of all, we talked about, and just to quickly recap here, in the current year, the drug listing has to be either newly listed or updated with a particular set of changes, or it has to be certified during that course of the year, and that's an annual activity. For a product to be included in the listing, it cannot be delisted, so discontinued, there's marketing end date, cannot be expired, it cannot be deficient, meaning the FDA has some deficiency action, data deficiency action typically. The FDA cannot have it marked as inactive, and the last product listing was submitted electronically. Now, this was more of an issue many years ago when there were actually last listing was in paper or in PDF. Hopefully their market has moved over to electronic at this point in time, but that's still a requirement. There's a couple of those sitting out there that we see every once in a while. And the criteria continues. So it has to meet all of these particular items. And the last submitted SPL listing has to be accurate and up to date. Now, that's kind of a very broad term, but it fleshes out to a lot of individual detailed checks. So certainly the labeling narrative needs to be current, up to date. All the metadata, the drug listing metadata about the product. A number of years ago, there was a combo product field that needed to be filled in and caused some disruption. Back in 2018, the prescription drug packaging image needs to show the product identifier. So there was a little image that needed to show the NDC number, the lot number, the serial number, and the expiration date. Hopefully that's year or so over and now understood and able to be accommodated, but we can answer questions about that. And then the other criteria is that the SPO listing that you're referring to will pass the current validation rules. So maybe the last one that you submitted was, who knows, a year and a half or so ago, and passed the validation rules. But as you know, the FDA continues to evolve those sets of validation rules. And if it were to be checked today, it would fail. So that is definitely an area of concern, and we'll talk more about that. The other large roadblock is many times the reference establishments that are referred to in the certification, they may not be currently registered. And there's a whole trail of establishments connected to these drug products. So there is a large amount of detail work, homework that needs to be done to make sure that a particular drug listing does qualify for the certification.
And Gary, just to jump in real quick, we were just having a conversation about this the other day, and when it comes back to that contract manufacturer coordinating with the private label distributor, well, a lot of it is the contract manufacturer confirming that did any of the qualifiers that were listed in their facility registration change? Did FDA change any of those? So if an organization had consistently been doing no change to our facility registration, you have to ensure that now those qualifiers are accurate to what FDA's requirements are today. So another piece, it's not always just the drug listings you're looking at. It could also be the facilities that are being registered, ensuring those are up to date and accurate.
Yep, very good. It's good, good point there. What data is included in the drug certification? So there's information about the authorized agent, this would be the individual actually submitting the drug certification, the BNCC. And in addition to that information, there's accompanying information for the actual manufacturing establishment site. So each of the establishments would have company name and a DUNS number connected with them. And then, in addition, a list of NDC product codes that have some business operation at that particular establishment site. How do you certify? Well, in general, it's a pretty easy step, 1, 2. First one there is to create a blanket no change certification in an SPL format, in that electronic format. There's some details there that you would need to observe as you go about creating that, making sure that you have new values, pull the registration together, and then once that is built, make sure it adheres to all the SPL validation rules, and then submit it. Now, this submission is a standalone SPL submission, much like the listing submission itself. But the BNCC submission is not part of a particular drug product ECTD submission. And if you are using the electronic submission gateway, then this particular submission is directed to the Office of the Commissioner. So there's a number of different methods that are available that you can consider in preparing and submitting your particular BNCC and making sure you satisfy the regulations. So over on the left-hand side, you see the labeler collecting the data and now having a structured format of that data. And in the middle are 4 different methods that you could select from. The first one being basically an outsourced service, where you supply that data to an outsourced service provider, and that entity then builds the SPL and submits it. That's actually the RegTech model in the solution that we have in place to support this particular activity. Another option would be that you have a vendor tool, or maybe even an internal built tool that, again, takes the data, builds the particular SPL, and then has a connection to the electronic submission gateway. There are 2 methods available from the FDA. One is the X forms, and you're able to do similar type of thing, manually enter the data there, or use Cedar Direct, another tool that allows you to build the content and create an SPL and submit it. Now, there's a subtle difference. The first 3 submit that SPL through the electronic submission gateway. The last one, Cedar Direct, builds an SPL, but in the background, it does submit that SPL directly to the database at FDA. All of these particular BNCC files that come in are passed or subject to a lot of validation rules and checks and so on. We'll see that in a minute. But if everything looks good and passes, then the NDC directory is updated. There's a NDC SPL data elements file, which is very important and used by CMS for reimbursement and so on. That would be updated. And also the National Library of Medicine Daily Med public connection to these particular listings would be available. There's a big question, when do you actually certify? And we are right now in the midst of this particular time period. So October 1 through December 31 is when this blanket no change certification needs to occur. So it actually coincides with the establishment registration that David was referring to earlier. And it's this 3-month window, 4th quarter, very busy period of time with a lot of activity. Noteworthy is that any early submissions prior to October 1 or a late submission after December 31 are not valid. So you do have to make sure that you schedule your resources and time and so on to make sure that this particular BNCC file is submitted and accepted inside that window. Now, there's a couple other time items on there that refer to the drug listing. And there's 2 periods of review and update that a labeler must perform. In June and also in December, regulations indicate that a drug listing has to be reviewed and updated in those particular times. But then they also encourage registrants to update information, certainly prior to commercial distribution, initially, but then update it throughout the course of the year at any time that it occurs. So they do want to keep the drug listing information fresh, and obviously you need to coordinate that drug listing updates with that BNCC. So what does the FDA check when they receive that blanket no change? Here's a couple items that I just highlighted at a high level. The file itself is actually checked to make sure that's a valid SPL file, it's formed correctly and meets all the criteria. And then upon opening it up, obviously they see these NDC codes that we talked about earlier. Are they in fact valid numbers? And there's cross-checking going on just to make sure that these products are not delisted, that the products are not expired, that they don't have any data deficiencies, and they're not inactive. So there's a lot of cross-checking going on to make sure that these NDC product codes are valid. From that, there's linking back to the SPL listing files that mention these particular NDC product codes. So those particular SPL listing files then are passed through or run through the current SPL validation rules. And hopefully it's all successful and it passes without incident. But there could be a hiccup here where a particular SPL listing files met validation in the past, but now it doesn't. So that is one of the items that you need to be aware of. And lastly, I just kind of highlighted another major area where those reference establishments that are linked to this particular activity are checked to make sure that the registrations are valid and that they are current. Well, what happens if the drug certification fails? So as it goes back and forth with all these cross checks, there's a lot of content that's being verified. Very possible that one or more of those particular items that they check will fail. The bad news here is that none of the listed NDC product codes will be certified. So the whole file is basically stamped failed, and now a lot of activity needs to be performed and some evaluation needs to be done to discover those particular errors, and if necessary, remove a particular NDC product code from the list, and then go through and update that BNCC SPL file with new version number and doc ID and date and so on, and then resubmit it. But then you also have in parallel to take that particular error and go to the drug listing, or maybe the error was connected to an establishment registration, make those corrections and resubmit those files as standalone SPL listings. So this is extremely important. You don't want to get behind the 8 ball here with trying to resolve this, at the end of December and not enough time to do the evaluation. So it's one of the concerns that comes up all the time, where it looks like it's very simple activity, just do a BNCC, but as you start to unravel it and go through the procedures, there's a number of issues.
Yeah, and Gary, I'll step in here again and point out that as your portfolio expands, it becomes more complicated reviewing all of this. And that kind of communication between, if you're not manufacturing the product, with your private label distributor being critical, right? Ensuring you know what's happening, who's doing what, because if it fails or if you miss the window, you then have to re-drug list every single product. So there's a pretty significant implication if you don't certify the portfolio. But then again, remember, if you have drug listed any of your products in this current year, they're certified through next year. So we'll talk a little bit more on these steps as we go through the presentation here of what to keep in mind through that.
Okay, very good. I think there's a couple more foundation slides here, and then we'll get over to some good practical steps in submitting a BNCC. Well, a lot of people ask, well, what if I guess now down to December 31st and it just didn't happen? I either didn't have resources, didn't have time, but anyway, the drug was not updated in the current year and no certification took place. Well, January 1, the FDA is going to flag that particular listing and mark it as expired. There is some significant impacts of that, and technically now that drug product violates the FDA regulations and is misbranded if you were to try to continue to market it. The expired flag shows up in the NDC directory. This particular drug product then is removed from the NSDE file, and it's noted in the Daily Med. So this particular event now starts to propagate out to the public and to the downstream users of this particular drug product. Now, you are able to make a correction and get back on the road here. You are able to submit a drug listing SPL at the beginning of the year and submit that drug listing SPL to correct that expired flag. But one of the points that David was making is that is done on an individual drug listing basis. So if you had 100 drug listing product codes that you had in your BNCC, and for whatever reason never got it done, now you would have to submit those 100 SPL listings individually. So there's some ramifications of not making that deadline. There's one other thing I'd just like to pass on. Back in 2017, when blanket no change was being rolled out, Paul Novak at the FDA mentioned that some companies would just let their product go into expire status and not delist. So and his point was, don't let expired be the lazy way to delist. Those two activities, those two statuses are not the same. So expired is only for those products that are not newly listed, updated, or certified in a particular calendar year. Delisted means that that particular product is removed from commercial distribution with a end date, marketing end date. So yeah, if you don't do anything, your product eventually will go into this expired category at the end of the year. But that is quite different than submitting an SPL and giving a commercial end date. So let's see. I think what we'll do is just do a quick reminder for everyone that if there's questions that come up, go ahead and enter them in the chat box. And Aaron is keeping a good eye on those as they come in, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those. And now I'd like to turn this over to David and have him walk through some of these very practical steps in creating a successful blanket no change certification. So David, it's yours.
Great, thanks, Gary. Yeah, and so these next 5 steps are really ways that we've assisted clients and helped. And what we found is these are the best ways to really lay out this project. Like as Gary had mentioned, first and foremost, you should start early. Like now's the time to start reviewing a lot of this data. So you can go to the next slide there, Gary. So the first step, we'll kind of lay out the steps and then go into each of them in a little bit more detail. But identifying the products, identifying the product labels that you're certifying is that real primary first step. Second step then being determining the status of this, right? Is it current? Is it already certified through next year because of a previous drug listing in this calendar year? Or is some type of step needed to certify? Third step being now working to prepare your technical file for the blanket no change certification and submit it. Fourth step, which hopefully by now you could just sit back with a nice iced tea or lemonade and say, all right, we're done. But hey, if there are any errors, fourth step is let's start correcting those errors. And then fifth step, submitting updates. So this is traditionally the process we see, but again, it could be as simple as 3 steps for your organization. All right, so identifying the labels or identifying the product codes that we're going to be certifying. The main location that we tend to start with is, let's start at the facility registration location. So starting at the Deckers site or the drug establishment current registration site to then view, is the facility that is being registered active, and or the facility that's on the actual drug listing, is that active and current? From there, downloading the NDC product directory or the NDC directory. You can, so this is where it starts getting a little complicated for different organizations. So for distributors or private label distributors, you can find both the active and excluded product lists in this database. You can, for manufacturers, you can find all unfinished products, so APIs, drugs for further processing, bulk products. But when it comes to a scenario where a contract manufacturer is manufacturing on behalf of a private label distributor, those CMOs would have a product listing type of product manufactured under contract. Those aren't actually publicly listed by FDA. So that's where it becomes critical to the process of managing your data. So a lot of our clients are utilizing ReadTech Single Source for drug products, a software tool that helps them to see their data at a high level, understand what's been updated, what hasn't. If not, you might be using a Cedar Direct or another application. So it's really critical to ensure you have all of your data in a location where you can quickly review it and ensure whether it needs to be certified in this calendar year. Yeah, so next slide, Gary. So the second step would now be, okay, we've gathered our data, we know what products are there, determining the status. So has it gone through that checklist Gary showed earlier? Is this product, have we drug listed this? Are there any additional updates to make to it in this calendar year? No? All right. No action needed because we've already updated and that product is now certified through next year. Is it a product with a known data deficiency? Is it showing up on the excluded list? If so, then what do we need to do to fix that data? So determining that status is critical in walking through then what needs to be done and then categorizing them into groups. So with the blanket no change process, you literally, the way FDA is looking for the data to be, as Gary had shown earlier, is you're listing those NDC product codes under the manufacturing facility that's manufacturing those products. So ensuring that you're gathering all that data, putting it into the right place, and then going on to step 3, which is preparing that data into the technical format. So this is a great example here. You will say ReadTech Horsham is manufacturing this first set of 4 products. ReadTech Ireland manufactures the other 3. What one might do is start gathering all this data, using this as a template to get our information straight, and then from there, double checking each code to say, okay, is this correct? Do we have it where it needs to be? And then once you ensured, yep, we've reviewed, let's go ahead, build the file, we validate it against FDA's rules, and then we submit the SPL. And then hopefully we get that acknowledgement back that everything's passed, wipe our hands, move on to the next step, which might be updating our drug listings. But if for any reason an error does come back, that's where we then want to really review what the errors are. This is where an organization might start considering, well, what is it, right? Is it a facility that's causing this error? Do we have a manufacturer who may have been doing no changes that now doesn't have an accurate representation of their business processes? Is it an error with one of our product listings? Or is it just an error with maybe one of the DUNS numbers referenced in our blanket no change certification file? So really reviewing and determining the source of those errors is a key step here within correcting the errors and then correcting them, right? Will fixing it be a matter of adjusting our blanket no change certification file, or do we actually have to update drug listings? So if so, right, if it's, you just needed to update the facility, make sure that your manufacturing facility has been updated. Now everything will pass. It may be it was an error with the listing. In that scenario, we can remove those listings from this blanket no change file and resubmit the blanket no change file to certify the other products that didn't have errors. And then that passes. But then you have to go through the process of now updating those specific drug listings that had the errors and identifying what those are. And then rebuilding the blanket no change, as I'd mentioned, once you've adjusted any or corrected any of the errors. So really those steps, this is kind of step 4A, B, and C, if you will. But the main point is going to be determining the source, correcting them, and then the rebuild piece could be a multi-step piece as well that doesn't just include the BNCC. And it may not be in this exact order. It might be we do the facility first, then we update the blanket no change, then we move on to our drug listings. And then submitting updates. So that would be kind of that last step of step 4. And we separated this into a separate step because there is additional data review that we need to go through to ensure that the drug listing that needs to be updated wasn't just a simple update to the version number and the date, right? Are there any data elements within the listing that have errors? Is there a data discrepancy with the FDA? Does FDA want us to review anything with them before we go ahead and update this drug listing? So yeah, this is a critical step, because if you fail everything else and don't do a blanket no change certification on this calendar year, you have to do this for every single one of your products to get them back into that active list and not the excluded list. So that excluded list is one, again, you want to keep out of. Traditionally, the excluded list is going to be reserved for organizations that are out of business and had never delisted their products. And as stated previously by the FDA at the SPL Jamboree back in 2017, they don't want you taking that as an easy way to get out of delisting. Delisting is an important process that then ensures the files are then archived, because excluded products may still show up in public databases, like the NDC directory. Information will be redacted, if not completely removed, but also it may still show up on DailyMed, where it'll have big red letters on that DailyMed listing showing this has information that is deemed as expired by the FDA. So definitely information to make sure you're doing properly. And then the last step of submitting these updates would then be ensuring that what you had submitted is showing up properly in the facility registration, the Deckers site, making sure information is showing up properly in the NDC directory, as well as DailyMed, if that's where you traditionally find that information. Great, so I'll swing it back on over to Aaron then to start with a poll question that we'd like to kind of get gauge everyone's kind of interest here, and also help you all understand a little bit more about how industry is preparing this.
Yes, thank you, David. So I am going to put up the poll question now and give everybody just about 30 seconds to a minute to answer. So how do you plan to prepare and submit your blanket no change certification? And you can please select one of the following answers. The FDA CDER Direct or X Forms, an internal system, an outsourced service, you're still unsure on what you're doing, or you actually need some help deciding what you'd like to do. So I see we're getting some answers coming in, and we'll give it just about 20 more seconds, and hopefully some more of you can give us some insight. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And here are the results that we're seeing so far. So it looks like about 19% of you are going directly with the FDA. We have 10% using internal systems, 63% outsourced, 6% unsure, and 3% that need some help deciding. So thank you for everyone that participated in that poll. And I will pass things, oh, just a quick reminder one more time. We have had some really good questions coming in so far, so I do appreciate those. And I'm going to continue keeping an eye on that chat box until the end when we do a little bit of Q&A. So definitely make sure to send in any questions that you may have. And with that, I will hand the presentation back to you, Dave.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So for those of you that are undecided, still looking for some assistance or help, ReadTech, we do assist with this process. And again, like I suggested earlier, definitely get started early. One of the main points I'd like to make and always stress is, first, this is specifically for human drugs. Like Gary had mentioned earlier, CVM has a separate process. The other piece is, if you're new to this, if this is 2020 was the first year you've ever submitted product data to the FDA, your products are certified through 2021. So you won't have to start any of this process really until next year this time. So it gives you some time to, again, sit back, have a lemonade or a beverage of your choice, and enjoy everyone else's misery in reviewing their data. But that's what we love to do, is review the data, assist in really getting this process simplified and moving forward. So Gary, why don't you kind of move through to the next slide, and I believe it's the overview. So in the general overview Gary had painted out earlier, where there are multiple methods in which you could be doing this. Really what we do here at ReadTech that separates us from a lot of industries, there is a client success team where we can assist with that process. Our data conversion staff is also extremely knowledgeable with this, and we do lend out that assistance to reach out to us if you're an organization who is really questioning, okay, whether we work with ReadTech or we don't, how are we going to get this process moving forward? Reach out to us. We're here to help. But really, at its essence, what we do is we provide a data collection form for our clients to use year after year. And as the data experts, what we ensure is that the files that are then being prepared, validated, and submitted to the FDA will pass. And if for any reason there are errors, we're there to then assist with the review of those errors. And then it may be a scenario where we suggest, okay, let's create separate blanket no change files for this. So those are the things that we excel in and we really like to assist with. That information then goes through the electronic submissions gateway, as I'd mentioned, that is then communicating those acknowledgements or errors. And then in the long run, and then the goal of this process is to ensure that the information is then passed and then published to all of these various files. One of the other things I'd like to point out is this has serious implications for an organization who might be manufacturing products outside of the United States. If your product is crossing the border to get in, if any of the data is ending up in that expired list, your product could very likely be seized and not make it past until you correct the data. So that NSDE list, those lists that are then used by other governmental organizations here in the US that are driven by the SPL, it's very important to make sure you're checking all those boxes. So that goes back to that, the responsibility of the contract manufacturer and the private label distributor. So if you are a private label distributor that's handling your own blanket no change certification, you definitely want to make sure that your contract manufacturer is also doing their piece, ensuring that their NDC codes that are registered for this type of product are being certified as well. So like I said earlier, always best to start immediately. In fact, I'd like to suggest even starting in mid to end of September, so that way you can really start working things through and enjoy the holidays here in the States, right? Really allow yourself that time so you're not trying to, like as Gary mentioned, December, end of December, middle of December. All right, well, I think we need to do this. Do we need to do this? Like really try to make sure you start communicating with us early if you're utilizing ReadTech for this process. And if you're not, make sure you're starting early with your internal stakeholders and external private label distributor partners or CMO partners to ensure you understand everything that's being certified, to ensure it's all comprehensive certifications going through on both ends. So really to boil down what it is that we're helping with, so the preparation of the SPL, that's what we're known best for here at ReadTech Life Sciences. Submission preparation, right, and that assistance. On-time deliveries, right, we have standard timeframes in which we will prepare this. We also offer expedited preparation along with off-hour support. So whether it be evening, weekends, we can assist with that. Submission error and remediation, right? This is where it comes to, oh, we had something fail. What is it that failed? All right, ReadTech, could you help us out? And then the storage of this information, ensuring that that we are keeping the information on file for our clients, and then ensuring that updating those details in following years with the appropriate set ID and so forth, document ID, and all the right pieces that need to be done to ensure accurate submissions. Gary, did you have anything to point out or anything to add to that process?
But I just want to say that over the course of years, I've been very fortunate to help a number of clients work their way through a lot of SPL doc types, and more recently this blanket no change certification. And we're glad to provide our expertise and help, and very glad to again offer the subject matter expertise in getting a good understanding of what needs to be done and deciphering some of the codes. So sometimes you read some things in regulations and you might get some codes back, and it just is overwhelming. So I think you had touched on it, but the submission error remediation and being able to couch coach you through this particular activity and guide you and help you understand it, I think is one of the soft benefits. It's a little bit hard to put some value on it, but it's extremely valuable, and our clients have over the years been very appreciative of help that they're able to receive from us. So I'll throw that out there as well as something to consider with ReadTech.
Yeah. Great.
Aaron, do you want to go over? Go ahead. You want to go over some of the education resources?
I think that's a great point to kick it back over to Aaron.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Gary and David, for that presentation. And thank you all for attending as well. For more information on this and more topics, you can visit the Knowledge Center on readtech.com. As you see on this slide, you specifically are probably interested in the drug and biologic product submissions section, which falls under the life sciences tab. And then, of course, you can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for additional blog posts and information about upcoming webinars and more. And of course, for more information, you can also contact the ReadTech team directly using one of the methods shown on the screen. So of course, it's our email, phone number, and website if you wanted to jot it down real quick, but it will also be in the slide deck that you receive in the next few days. So now moving on to the Q&A section. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions via the chat box. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have had quite a few questions come through. So as I mentioned in the beginning, just due to time constraints, we may not get to all of them, but we will definitely be sure to reach out to you with an answer to your question if we don't have time to get to it right now. So to kick things off, if a product has been listed with a marketing end date, will we still get an error if that SPL is included in our blanket no change?
So if a product is listed with a marketing end date, it doesn't have to be included in the blanket no change certification. In fact, that was something that's been added to the NDC directory download, is there is now a qualifier in that validation that's showing this product is set to be delisted at X date. So if it's added, will it create an error is a good question. Gary, have you had experience on that, or is that one we should leave as, okay, is adding it to the blanket no change certification going to create an error as well?
Yeah, I think might do some additional homework on that one, and some of the validation rules kind of change over the course of time. But if you have a future marketing end date, you do need to go ahead and certify that particular NDC product code. If it has already been discontinued in the past, then there's no reason, and now it's delisted. Delisted products do not need to be mentioned in the certification, but if it's a future end date that you scheduled a year or so out, that particular NDC, as I understand it, would need to be included in the blanket no change.
And like Gary said, we'll get confirmation, but I actually believe, Gary, you don't include it in the NCC. So
okay.
There's a little discrepancy between the panelists, yeah. So we'll definitely follow up on that. But from my understanding, you do not include it because it could create a potential error. But again, we'll follow up on that. And yeah, so we'll follow up on that, Aaron. I think you may be on mute.
Yeah. So our next question, when you dictate a standalone submission, should we still maintain version numbering and keep the same set ID?
Yeah, that's a really important consideration. And the recommendation is that if you're making changes for this particular year, let's say an error came back and now you have to make some changes to the BNCC, all those standard SPL versioning activities would apply. So a new doc ID, a new date, a new SPL version number, all those need to be updated. But you can keep the same set ID for this particular year. At least that's our recommendation. Don't delete anything that was in there originally. Only remove the ones that are problematic and causing errors, because this new version that you now submit will basically override everything that you had submitted in the past with previous versions. Now, when it comes to next year, the recommendation is to create a brand new set ID, basically create a new family of BNCC document with one or more versions for the following year. David, have you heard anything differently along those lines?
Not that's right on, and especially if you have multiple blanket no change files you're submitting in the same year, that set idea applies, right? So if you submitted, there's an error, you need to update, utilize that same set ID. But let's say, for example, a manufacturer or distributor who has hundreds of products that are taken in chunks, each of those blanket no changes you submit that have different data should have different set IDs. So it's because essentially what could happen is if you utilize the same set ID, it would, like Gary had mentioned, overwrite that data from the previous version of that set ID you had submitted.
Yeah, we didn't mention the tact and the approach to have multiple BNCCs being pursued during the single calendar year. But if you have a pretty large inventory, you might want to break them up and attack them in a smaller group area where if you have success with maybe 25 or 30, that's great. You can check those off and say, okay, that particular batch now is done, and then work on the other BNCCs with their particular related product codes. It does take a little bit of organization just to make sure that you don't, as David had mentioned, that you don't confuse the set IDs, and that when you have a particular group, its main identifier, the set ID of that SPL, remains constant and not to be reused in any of the other particular groups, because now you created confusion and you have a lot more work than what you were hoping for, rather than trying to simplify.
Great, thank you guys. So does the facility registration need to be current through next year in order to avoid an error on the blanket no change certification?
Yeah, do you want to take that one, David? But basically, as I understand, yes. So you do have to, in the 3-month window, your facility registration, establishment registration needs to occur with either an update, or you can submit a no change to that establishment registration. And then that particular activity during fourth quarter of this year is actually setting that to be current for the following year. So anyway, do you want to add something there, David?
Yeah, and actually, I apologize, Aaron. I got distracted by my neighbor's chicken that came walking into my backyard here. But could you please repeat the question, and I'll expand on if Gary, there's anything else to add?
Hasn't been distracted by a chicken. So the question was, does the facility registration need to be current through next year in order to avoid an error on the blanket no change certification?
Right. Okay, yeah. So as Gary mentioned, as long as it's current now, the blanket no change certification will pass. But it is a best practice to make sure things are being updated. Now, if a facility has gone out of business and then they're not going to be certifying through next year, yeah, if you certify through it now, great, you got it. However, that goes back, it goes back to the point earlier in the regulation where you are certifying that nothing has changed here. So if there is a change, yeah, one could argue that certifying it now before that fails or before that is removed would ensure you're checking that box, but you're going to want to get in place something for next year to ensure that when this time frame comes around next year, you're not in that predicament. Because we've seen that happen before, where someone will say, well, we can certify, but that manufacturer's going out of business. They're not certifying next year. So that's yeah, good question.
Great. Moving right along. So if you have already submitted an SPL for content change earlier this year, do you still need to do a blanket no change certification?
So if you've already submitted a drug listing SPL for content changes, then that product is already certified through next year. So there's really two methods of certifying products. The first, drug listing SPL updates. And if you haven't done that throughout the calendar year, then you can consider doing a blanket no change certification, which is really FDA's way of making it easier on industry to just list their codes that are being certified instead of doing individual drug listings each time.
Sure. This seems like almost a follow-up question here from a different individual, though. So if you don't have any changes to your SPL submission from last year, instead of doing the blanket no change, can you just submit the exact same SPL file?
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yep. Oh, wait, actually, Gary, does the set ID and version number have to be updated?
Yeah, when I was assuming that they would make those versions and date updates, so you can't submit the exact same file, but the content can be resubmitted. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's data element adjustments, but yes. But then that's the whole point of the blanket no change certification, is making it easier on you. So once you get into more than 3 products, I'd probably say, or even 2, the process of loading those 3 NDC product codes or more into a blanket no change certification is probably easier and less time consuming than updating each of the individual product listings. So that's the kind of the idea behind the blanket no change certification, is to really make this obligation of certifying every product easier. And for anyone wondering, the chickens have been rescued.
And with that, it's probably a good time to wrap up now that we know what happened to the chickens. So there are still a few outstanding questions, so we will definitely make sure that we follow up with you all if you submitted a question that has not been answered. Most of those questions were very specific, so it's probably better to follow up one-on-one anyway, and hopefully give you some valuable advice.
Aaron, I just want to mention, while we were doing some Q&A here, I did do a little research and confirm that if a drug product has a marketing end date and it's now marked complete, so in that particular case, you do not need to certify that particular drug listing. So a marketing end date with complete status does not need to be certified.
And then to further it, even if it does have a future end date, meaning it's still in the NDC directory, it's still on Daily Med, does not need to be included in that.
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Gary.
All right. Sorry, Aaron, that was last minute breaking news here.
No, that's wonderful. And I should have asked Dave, do you have anything else to add as well?
No, I think I look forward to the questions that we didn't get to address. Like Aaron said, we will absolutely address those, and primarily we like to address them individually because it's not all public questions, but anyone who has any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us through any of the methods we've shown in this presentation.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder, you can email us at pharma@readtech.com, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you have. We do want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today and for all of your participation. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.